Hello, welcome back to Galactic Reviews. My name is Payson, and previously, before I had done a review of sorts, reading the article from ScreenRant, 10 Harsh Realities of Rewatching Pixar Films, or at least older Pixar films, and lo and behold, they have also done one about old animated Disney films. Yeah, so this ought to be interesting to at least read and see whether or not I agree or disagree with them. More than likely, if it's a lot like the first one, or it was Pixar, in which they were very picky and choosy on specific movies instead of an overall sort of thing, that was a problem with most of them back in the heyday, well, then I'm probably going to be tearing this thing apart again. But without any further ado, let's get started. Alright, so they already go ahead and say at the top here that there are a number of unpleasant realities that become apparent upon rewatching classic Disney animated movies. So they already acknowledge that these are these are already classics. So this ought to be interesting to see how exactly. More than likely they'll sugarcoat it. So here we go. This is the first paragraph in which they sugarcoat everything, and then they go down to here. At the same time, it must also be admitted that there are some harsh realities, blah, 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 that viewers have to face when they rewatch various Disney animated movies from throughout the studio's history. While some aspects of the movies hold up, some of their shortcomings have only become more glaringly obvious with the passage of time. Basically saying that it's nothing more but petty. It's like it's basically telling millennials and upcoming Gen Zers, if this movie could hurt your feelings, so if you need to go talk to your psychiatrist right away, right after watching this movie, because you might have some insensitive problems and you might go into heart attack. I think it might be the Pfizer. But regardless, that's kind of what they're saying. They're kind of like giving a forewarning, saying that warnings need to be labeled all over these films because of problems that they have. Now this one I'd actually agree with. However, I would say it actually isn't a problem. I agree with what they're saying to the most sense, at least in the first part where the princes lack personality to some degree. I would agree to some extent, but it's not really necessary in the film. These are mostly princess films. It's mostly about the princess, not the prince. The prince is sort of the back character, really not a whole bunch of development needed for his character. It's mostly on the princess and possible side characters that are along the road. The prince is more so the backup side character, like the side character. Ironically enough, at least in this, it's pointing to more than just one example, like they did in the Pixar films, where it was just pointing at one example and saying that's a problem for apparently all the Pixar films and the studio as a whole. Whereas this one, it's pointing at multiple. And this one, ironically enough, it's saying it's not that they're bad characters. Right here, it says it's not that they're bad characters necessarily. It's just that they are so much less interesting than their princess counterparts to such an extent that it is sometimes easy to forget them altogether. To some extent, I would agree, but like I said before, it's not necessarily about the story. Really doesn't revolve around them. To some extent. Like, it really doesn't revolve around them, and it just isn't necessary. I don't think that's necessarily a bad point. I just don't think... Well, that point actually does have some credence to it. I don't think that's a good point to make as to why these movies could be somewhat seen as either problematic or could be seen as, like, not really being entertaining. Because I'm assuming that's what this is for, why it's not going to be as entertaining to the younger generation. The gender roles are outdated. Well, this one ought to be fun. Kind of point to Beauty and the Beast, and as well as Aladdin, with Jasmine and Belle on there. However, though they might be somewhat thinly drawn, there is also no escaping the fact that many of these Disney princes are the ones who drive the majority of the action. With some exceptions, the various princesses, including more active ones like Jasmine and Belle, rely on the male characters to save them from whatever dangers they find themselves in. That's not a problem, it's a princess film. You realize, like, men were technically the providers and the rescuers, and women wanted to be saved. That's kind of how it's always been. So them saying that this is gender roles mainly just points to it being a problematic thing for Gen Z and millennials. So, and honestly, my generation's retarded, so... well, I'll say this. a portion of my generation is retarded. A bigger portion of my generation, I don't think really cares. But once again, a lot of my generation is still in high school. Obviously, some of this stems from the source material. Some of it stems from moments in which they were produced. Nevertheless, for a new generation of movie watchers, some of the more glaring gender dynamics in this movie can be jarring and more than a little vexing. I guess that's why Moana doesn't have a prince and why Anna and Elsa basically save themselves. I think that's what they're pointing towards. I could be wrong. Once again, I don't think this is a good point to make overall. If you're making this point for millennials and Gen Zs, whatever my stupid generation is called, this is a dumb point to make. In all honesty, the point is, this is a very dumb point. And this is something that the reason why these are in here is to some extent this is something that everybody can identify with to some extent or another. Whether you like it or dislike it is immaterial. It's meant to kind of draw in the audience to kind of at least somewhat understand the characteristics of everything going on with something somewhat familiar. And these are at least somewhat familiar and have been around for the beginning of time. Some movies are just boring. I think this is mainly pointing towards the sequels, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, actually, no, I don't think it is. It's pointing to Pinocchio and Cinderella. Okay, yeah. I don't get this. Some movies are just boring. Well, with any studio, you're going to have hits and duds, and quite frankly, I'm not saying that none of these are boring, because, I mean, some of them can be boring depending on the kid watching it, depending on the person watching it. Some of these won't appeal to everybody. Like, me personally, don't really care for the princess films, shockingly enough. However, saying that movies are specifically boring just because it lacks some visual dynamism, okay, you also got to realize it's part of its time. It's essentially now part of history. One, because so many people beloved it during that time frame, and two, because it has become such a staple for the Disney franchise, and two, especially the childhood retellings of this classic fairy tale. So, while I don't get this one. I don't get this one either. I can get it to some extent, but to say that's a problem all throughout it, that's only going to be a problem on a personal level, not so much a overall level. Like, not so much on every person's probably going to have a Disney movie that they just aren't probably going to enjoy to watch, and that's fair. But to say that some movies are objective, like factually boring, you can't really say that unless like it's very much in accordance with nobody likes. Kind of like this next one. The end of the Renaissance wasn't good, and I like how they point to the one where it's got 3 female leads. I think that's ironic. Now, this one kind of just points towards Home on the Range, and granted, I think more so it was more like what's happening with Marvel. It's, to some extent, it's become more so a burnout with some of these tales, and burnout of how these were portrayed, I guess. I don't know. I'm guessing it was, because this is mainly, from what I can tell, this is mainly going off of ticket sales or how much people went to go see this movie in theaters, I would assume, considering that they are like saying like this is objectively a lackluster movie, and I would assume that that's because of the ticket sales. However, to say that this is probably a very lackluster movie, a lot of the films back then were. However, a lot of films like that, like Atlantis and Treasure Planet, which I just recently did a review on, also have become cult classics within the Disney fandom. So to say that all these movies that have been within this end of Disney Renaissance have been bad is a very much horrible catch-all statement. However, they kind of go ahead and say it here. It's not that such movies are explicitly bad per se, or per se, I guess. It's more so that they exhibit a certain sort of artistic aimlessness, and it becomes very clear quickly that they lack the same spark of creativity that made previous works a success. I would beg to differ. That's not always the case. Like Atlantis and Treasure Planet, both are post-Renaissance, very fun movies and very, very artistic, and very much show the same spark of creativity. So, especially Treasure Planet, considering that I did a nice twist on an age-old classic. Okay, now this one's about to hit a black spot. The 1980s was a bleak decade. All right, well, they put Fox and the Hound, Though there are a number of underrated Disney movies from the 1980s, such as Fox and the Hound and Black Cauldron, as a whole, the decade was a rather bleak one for the studio. I don't know, maybe they just weren't having enough return at the box office, and this is kind of what they were saying here. It's like, they didn't know the ebb and tide of flow, and apparently they didn't get it with... It could have been a whole bunch of things. It's not necessarily the movie's fault. It very much could have just been Disney's fault. Not going to say that it wasn't the movie's appeal, because a lot of these movies have become classics, like Fox and the Hound, and I don't know, I've never seen Black Cauldron, but I know Fox and the Hound is definitely one of my favorites. So to say that it hasn't become that, based on the box office history of 1980, that it's not as good, or that it wasn't a great step forward, at least for the studio, you could say that, or saying that as a... But you got to understand, this is under the guise of rewatching this. So rewatching this movie, that has nothing to do with it. Like, in a sense, this has nothing to do with it, and a lot more probably don't have anything to do with rewatching the movies anyway. Like, this really has nothing to do with rewatching the old movies. Like, if we're going to compare movies to movies, yeah, you could say that. You could definitely say, like, yeah, this one isn't as great, or lacks some stuff from it, but at least this point, if not the first one that I pointed out with the end of the Renaissance, at least this one has no reason for being in here, just because it is a harsh realities of rewatching stuff, not so much harsh realities of the 1980s. It's not saying like this is a problem because this movie has, this decade long of movies has some problems. This never says that. If anything, it just says it just didn't have the same, it didn't reach as many people as, say, Little Mermaid did, as other tales did. This probably was because this tale probably wasn't as well known. Very well could have been the case. And when they started doing like Lion King, which is a version of Hamlet, which was its own little classical tale, people were probably intrigued to go watch the movie, and were probably more intrigued to go watch a new retelling of a tale to some extent that they had known or had seen to some extent, than watch a completely old tale that they never heard of. I mean, if I had to guess, that'd be where I'd guess that too. But, you know, and they also could have just done bad marketing for it. That also could be a case from the 1980s. I have no idea. But I digress. I don't think that point should be in a harsh realities of rewatching Disney animated movies. Some sequels simply shouldn't exist. Okay, I can get that to some degree. It talks about Lion King. Obviously, it talks about Cinderella 2 and 3, I'm assuming, because that's what that's from, I'd assume. But they were more so there in order for them to specifically get more animators, or break-in animators, essentially get in new people to animate and kind of train them up with these direct-to-DVD movies. So the fact that with these direct-to-DVD movies, I can see that while this could be, some of the sequels shouldn't exist. All right, I guess, but I'd say that about Toy Story 4. But to say that these movies simply shouldn't exist is just that these movies are bad simply because they shouldn't exist. And they even say, like, they also managed to tarnish their original movies. Lion King 2 doesn't do that, and I would say Cinderella 2 and 3 actually expand on the stepsister. One of the stepsister also expands on the evilness of the stepmother, if I remember that correctly. At least the third one. I don't remember the second one. Heck, a lot of these I haven't even watched. Mulan expands on the lives of the three compatriots. Honestly, I probably only watched that movie because it had Mushu in it, and I liked the three compatriots, and since it was about them, I was like, let's go for it. But honestly, most of these I watched in school, and most of these I really didn't care for, but it was better than doing work, so that was a lot more fun. And here we go. Some of these are just plain racist. Now, obviously it points to Peter Pan, but this is about rewatching Disney animated movies, and it brings up Song of the South for no other reason than to bring up Song of the South. I don't know why it's an outdated representation of Native Americans. I'm trying to think what was wrong with it. Can't really think of anything. Let me know what was racist about Peter Pan down in the comment section below. Andrew might scold me later on that, but what the hey, I don't know exactly what what was racist about it. I don't know why they brought up Song of the South, but they kind of like, oh yeah, great. They really, really buck up to Disney saying, yeah, you really fixed your mistake there by saying, fortunately, it does seem as if the studio is learning from its past mistake as it now makes an effort to deliver more inclusive stories, creating movies like Moana and Encanto, which celebrate the cultures of the specific islands and Colombia, respectively, in a positive and sensitive manner. I don't have a problem with Moana. I don't remember watching I haven't watched Encanto. I really don't care to. It's a princess movie. Really don't have the care to watch that. And considering how it hasn't been marketed to death as Frozen has, so I guess it's not on that same stupidity level, but it's definitely gotten up there to the point where I don't really care to watch it. Unrealistic happy endings. Of course it has unrealistic happy endings. It's a freaking fairy tale. That's about the best way I can sum up this point as to why does it need to be here. A lot of these points are bad. Some of these points don't even need to be, can't even be in here, to be real. Unrealistic happy endings. I mean, it's a fairy tale. This is one of those things where it's like, it's gonna hurt you because it's lying to you, saying like, you don't need to watch this because you might have your feelings hurt because life isn't like this. It's like, well, yeah, it's for kids. It's a fairy tale to make you. It's a story made to help you feel better about life. Like, it's supposed to lift you up. It's the reason why you go into a theater, watch a good movie, you come back out a little better because you watched a good tale. You got to hear a good story. Same concept here. I don't get this at all. The history is almost always wrong. Obviously, they point to Pocahontas, which is way more complicated. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, I don't know the history on that. Mulan. I think Mulan essentially was just it's a folklore tale with very little evidence proving it or disproving it. So there's that. There's very little going in either direction. In Hercules, it's very much Greek god, and they were already messed up enough as it is, so they obviously need to change that in order for it to be more appealing to a family dynamic of a movie, a sort of family-friendly movie, as well as a more kid family-friendly movie. As far as Pocahontas goes, they try to keep it as historical as possible without making it crazy complicated. And I mean, I like this part here, where it says, in particular, Pocahontas remains Disney's most controversial princess movie due to its harmful rewriting of the real-life Pocahontas story. And do they cite a historical sort of site or point to history to some extent? No, they point to comic book resources. Wow, I don't think they expected people to... That's hilarious. Like, they're literally... Like, really? Really? Your best source for why Pocahontas is you don't even have to say harmful rewriting of the real-life Pocahontas story. You could just say it's a rewrite of it. Like, they obviously do a dig here. Harmful rewriting. It's not a harmful rewrite. Yeah, it killed so many Indians with this movie. Alright, last point that's about the dumbest one I've seen so far. Homophobia via LGBTQ plus minus coded characters. Always got to get that plus and minus. I didn't know they were adding, They're adding and subtracting at will. Disney has always excelled at creating great villains. These engaging characters, blah, 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 blah. At the same time, there's also no question that many of these villains are also coded so that they are meant to be seen as LGBTQ plus or non-normative in one way or another. So, yeah, I guess this is stupid. Among the list of queer-coded villains are Captain Hook, Ursula, and Maleficent. What? You want to repeat that again? Ursula, you could probably make a comment for, because I believe her character design was based off of a drag queen in the 90s or 80s or whatever. So, I guess. But that's about the only one you can make a case for. But even then, that's still stretching it. Like, Captain Hook, Ursula, and Maleficent, they do nothing that seems like sexual in the movies, like, at all. Besides, like, when Ursula tries to get married to Prince Eric before Ariel can, or so that way she can collect her soul. and then essentially trick the king, Trident, into, the whole movie. Maleficent, don't really think of anything there. Captain Hook, unless he was banging Mr. Smee in the galley in the back of the ship there, I really can't think of anything either. But considering that, and it's probably not great that Captain Hook is chasing kids, that's probably not a great thing to center. Like, your first one's Captain Hook. Yeah, the guy who's chasing kids on a deserted island, I don't really think that's that's not really a good one for even the alphabet community to be like, that's our guy. Like, that's not a good, it's pretty messed up. That is pretty stupid of him, if that's, okay, so, but that's basically all I've got for this. Don't forget to leave a like and a comment in the comment section down below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time on Galactic Reviews.